The warning arrived at 4:51 a.m., and it arrived the way warnings of this category always arrive, simultaneously across every node of a detection architecture that had been built specifically so that no single point of failure could suppress the information it carried. The infrared satellites in geosynchronous orbit over the Korean peninsula had detected the launch plume first, at 4:49 a.m., their sensors resolving the thermal signature of a solid-fuel ballistic missile motor igniting in the pre-dawn darkness of the North Korean interior with a clarity and speed that the ground-based radar network would not match for another 90 seconds. The satellite data had been processed, formatted, and transmitted to the relevant command nodes before the missile had cleared its launch canister. The ground-based early warning radars in Japan had acquired the ascending track at 4:50 a.m. and had confirmed the trajectory solution that the satellite data had already suggested. By 4:51 a.m., when the warning reached every relevant operational node simultaneously, the missile's trajectory had been computed with enough precision that the word Guam appeared in the threat assessment alongside a flight time estimate that left no ambiguity about the operational timeline every commander in the Pacific was now working against. The USS Lake Erie was operating in the Philippine Sea, 112 nautical miles east of the missile's projected ground track. She was a Ticonderoga-class cruiser, and she had been stationed in this specific operating area for 31 days as part of a ballistic missile defense posture that the relevant command had established and maintained in response to a pattern of North Korean test activity that had been escalating in frequency and range over the preceding 7 weeks. The posture had been established with the specific geometry that ballistic missile defense requires. The Lake Erie's position had been calculated against the projected launch windows and trajectory envelopes that the intelligence community's assessment had produced, and it had been maintained with the operational discipline that a 31-day sustained posture demands from a crew operating under continuous heightened readiness. The crew had not been standing at maximum alert for 31 consecutive days. Maximum alert is not sustainable over that duration. What the crew had been doing was maintaining the specific readiness architecture that ballistic missile defense requires. Rotations structured to ensure that the most experienced personnel occupied the critical CIC positions during the hours when historical launch pattern analysis indicated elevated risk, with a rapid escalation protocol that could bring the full crew to action stations within 90 seconds of a launch detection alert. The equipment had been tested, calibrated, and tested again. The SPY-1 radar had been exercised against simulated ballistic trajectories during the last 3 scheduled maintenance windows. The SM-3 interceptors in the VLS had been verified against their pre-launch checklists on a cycle that matched the threat assessment's elevated posture requirements. The engagement software had been updated twice during the 31 days with patches whose version numbers the weapons officer had tracked and validated against the baseline the engagement solution required. The crew had drilled the intercept sequence until the sequence had no wasted steps, and they had drilled the contingency variants that the planning had identified for cases where the nominal sequence encountered a specific category of complication. They had been waiting for this moment with the particular professional patience of people who are trained to respond to something they hope will never happen, and who understand, simultaneously, that the preparation is the thing that makes the outcome possible if it does. The CIC's Ballistic Missile Defense Watch Officer had the threat track on his display at 4:51 a.m. and 30 seconds. The track was clean. The radar picture was excellent. The Lake Erie's SPY-1 radar had acquired the target at 4:51 a.m. and had been building its track with the continuous, precise updating that the engagement solution required. The weapons officer, seated at the engagement control console, had been running through the pre-engagement checklist since the first alert. The checklist had been designed by people who understood that the margin between adequate preparation and inadequate preparation in an intercept engagement with the timeline that a ballistic missile's flight time creates is measured in seconds that compound. Every second of checklist completion was a second of engagement, readiness banked against the window that was already shrinking. The commanding officer reached the CIC at 4:52 a.m. He had been in his sea cabin, which was adjacent to the CIC, and the time between the alert reaching his bunk and his presence at the engagement console was 14 seconds. He reviewed the track data, the trajectory solution, and the engagement geometry in a single sweep of the display that took approximately 8 seconds. He asked one question. The weapons officer answered it. The commanding officer acknowledged and authorized the engagement. The authorization moved through the command architecture in the form that the relevant protocols required. This was not a unilateral decision by a ship's commanding officer in international waters. It was a decision that the protocols had been designed to enable at the speed the engagement timeline required, with the oversight the decision's gravity demanded, and with the accountability that any employment of this category of weapon carried. The authorization came back through the chain at 4:53 a.m. and 15 seconds. The weapons officer had the authorization confirmation on his display before the commanding officer had finished his acknowledgement of the return transmission. The SM-3 Block 2 A interceptor left the Lake Erie's vertical launch system at 4:53 a.m. and 51 seconds. The launch produced the physical signature that VLS launches always produce, the hydraulic pressure event that traveled through the hull, the brief illumination of the flight deck above the launcher, the thermal signature of the rocket motor visible on the bridge cameras for the seconds before the missile accelerated out of camera range and into the darkness above the Philippine Sea. The CIC's displays tracked it immediately. The engagement geometry was exactly as the pre-computed solution had described. The interceptor was on its planned trajectory. The target was on its computed trajectory. The two trajectories would intersect at a point in space above the atmosphere in the mid-course phase of the missile's flight, where the target was its most kinematically predictable and where the interceptor's direct impact warhead had the engagement geometry its designers had optimized it for. The Lake Erie's crew watched the engagement on their displays with the focused, controlled attention of people who have done everything the situation required and who are now at the point where the work they have done either produces the outcome they trained for or reveals a gap. The CIC was quiet. Not the quiet of inaction. The quiet of maximum attention applied to a display picture that was updating every fraction of a second with information that every person in the room was processing simultaneously. The radar officer was reading his display and speaking his track updates in the measured cadence of a professional whose voice carries no weight beyond the information it contains. The weapons officer was monitoring the interceptor's guidance state and the target's track continuity with the same measured attention. The commanding officer was standing behind the engagement console, watching both tracks on the main display, saying nothing because nothing needed to be said. At 4:57 a.m. and 22 seconds, the intercept occurred. The display showed it as the target track's last data point, followed by a debris signature that the radar resolved as multiple smaller returns spreading from the intercept point on trajectories consistent with fragmentation. The SPY-1 radar processed the debris field for 11 seconds before the radar officer made his report. The report used the word intercept and the word confirmed and no other words. The weapons officer logged the time. The commanding officer looked at the display for 3 seconds and then turned to the communications console and transmitted the confirmation report in the format the architecture required. The debris field was spreading. The radar was tracking the major fragments on their trajectories toward the ocean surface. The largest fragment, the remnants of the missile's re-entry vehicle, was on a trajectory that the tracking solution placed in the open Pacific approximately 400 miles east of Guam. Not on Guam. Not in Guam's territorial waters. An open ocean. The intercept had occurred at a point in the flight profile that had maximized the debris dispersion distance from the intended target. This was not an accident of geometry. It was the geometry that the engagement solution had been optimized to produce, because the people who had designed and positioned the Lake Erie's defensive posture had understood that where the debris landed was as operationally significant as whether the intercept occurred. The relief in the CIC was real, and it was brief. Brief because the operational picture had not returned to normal. It had produced a new situation. A ballistic missile had been launched from North Korean territory toward an American territory. The intercept had been successful. The missile had not reached its target, but it had been launched. The launch was an event of a character that the relevant command structures had planning documents for, and those planning documents described a set of actions that the intercept's success did not cancel. The intercept resolved the immediate threat. It did not resolve the situation that had produced the threat. The situation that had produced the threat was a launch complex somewhere in the North Korean interior that had just demonstrated an operational capability that was presumably in a post-launch configuration, and that was the subject of a targeting package that had been maintained and updated by the strike planning cell in the carrier air wing operating 60 miles to the southwest. The USS Ronald Reagan had been operating in the Philippine Sea as the carrier component of the defensive posture that the Lake Erie anchored. Her F-35C squadrons had been at elevated alert for 31 days alongside the Lake Erie's Missile Defense Watch. The strike planning cell had been maintaining a targeting package against the specific launch facility that the intelligence community's assessment had identified as the most probable source of any ballistic missile employment in this threat window. When the Lake Erie's intercept confirmation reached the Reagan's CIC at 4:57 a.m., the strike authorization request was already being formatted by the strike planning cell's duty officer. It had been formatted in advance, with blank spaces for the specific launch point coordinates that the trajectory solution would provide, because formatting a strike authorization request in real time after an intercept confirmation is a slower process than formatting it in advance and filling in the coordinates when they become available. The launch point coordinates from the trajectory back solution reached the Reagan's intelligence team at 5:02 a.m. The back solution was a trajectory analysis working backward from the intercepted missile's observed flight path to its origin point on the ground. The solution had a circular error probability that the intelligence team assessed against the pre-existing targeting package. The back solution's origin point was inside the targeting package's area of interest. Specifically, it was within 400 meters of the primary aim point that the targeting package had been built around. The pre-mission intelligence had been accurate. The facility that the package described was the facility that had launched. The strike authorization request reached the relevant command authority at 5:04 a.m. The command authority reviewed the intercept confirmation, the back solution, the targeting package, and the authorization framework that governed post-intercept response options. The authorization came back at 5:09 a.m. It was specific about the target. It was specific about the weapon systems authorized. It was specific about the collateral effect constraints that the facility's location within a military installation complex required. The constraints had been anticipated by the targeting package. The aim points and weapon configurations that the package described had been selected to achieve the required effect on the facility's operational infrastructure while satisfying the constraints. The strike planning cell had been waiting for this authorization for 31 days. They had built the package for it. They were ready for it. The F-35C launch began at 5:14 a.m. 4 aircraft, each carrying the precision-guided munitions that the targeting package specified, launched from the Reagan's flight deck in the sequence that the mission planning described. The flight deck crew worked in the pre-dawn darkness with the organized intensity that a combat launch requires and that carrier aviation produces through the disciplined integration of people and machinery that is the specific achievement of a carrier air wing. The aircraft cleared the flight deck, formed into their mission package, and turned northwest on the course that the navigation planning had computed as the optimal approach for the weapon employment geometry the targeting package required. The approach to the target area took 41 minutes. The mission package flew the approach profile at low altitude, using terrain features for radar masking where the route planning had identified opportunities, and maintained the communications discipline the mission required during the transit. The radar warning receiver in the lead F-35C had been quiet for the first 30 minutes of the transit. At the 31st minute, it indicated a surface radar emission from a bearing consistent with a North Korean ground-based air defense radar positioned in the coverage zone that the mission planning had identified as the primary air defense threat along this approach route. The emission was a search mode, not a track mode, not a guidance mode. A search mode indicated that the radar was operating in its standard surveillance configuration and had not yet acquired a specific track. The lead pilot noted the emission, checked its bearing against the mission planning's threat overlay, and confirmed that the approach route's terrain masking was performing as the planning had modeled. The radar's search beam swept through the approach corridor twice during the next 4 minutes without transitioning to a track mode. The masking was holding. At 5:54 a.m., the mission package reached the weapon employment range for the primary aim points. The pilots had their targeting systems locked on the coordinates that the package specified. The approach geometry was within the parameters the package had been built around. The lead pilot transmitted the weapon's free call on the mission frequency, and the employment sequence began. Each aircraft employed its munitions in the order and on the aim points that the package specified. The releases staggered across a 40-second window that produced the time-on-target sequence in the package required. The munitions ran their terminal approach profiles and impacted the facility's operational infrastructure across a 9-second window beginning at 5:56 a.m. and 34 seconds. The lead F-35C's targeting pod was recording the impacts on its optical and infrared systems. The imagery was being transmitted in real time to the Reagan's CIC, and from there to the strike planning cell, where the duty officer was conducting the initial battle damage assessment that the post-strike reporting would require. The first impact had addressed the facility's launch control infrastructure. The second and third had addressed the launch canister storage and preparation complex. The fourth had addressed the facility's independent power generation system. The fifth through eighth impacts had addressed the tunnel complex access points that the targeting package had identified as the facility's primary survivability feature. The tunnel access points were the most operationally significant elements of the package because they determined whether the facility could reconstitute its operational capability from the hardened infrastructure beneath its surface. sealed tunnel access was not permanent incapacitation. It was operational disruption of a duration that the relevant planning horizon found sufficient. The battle damage assessment imagery that the duty officer was reviewing showed 11 seconds of impacts across a facility that had, 9 seconds before the first impact, been a functional ballistic missile launch complex and was now something different. The structures that had been present in the pre-strike imagery were altered. The access points were altered. The power generation signature that the facility had been producing continuously since the collection architecture began monitoring it 3 weeks earlier was not present in the post-strike infrared imagery. The duty officer did not use the word destroyed. The word he used was suppressed, with a notation about reconstitution timeline assessment pending higher resolution post-strike imagery. Suppressed was the operationally correct characterization. Suppressed was sufficient. The F-35C mission package turned southeast at 5:57 a.m. and began the return transit to the Reagan. The radar warning receiver was quiet throughout the return. The surface radar that had been in search mode during the approach did not transition to track mode at any point during the transit. The terrain, masking that the route planning had designed, had performed as modeled. The aircraft recovered aboard the Reagan between 6:38 a.m. and 6:44 a.m. The flight deck crew received them with the efficiency that recovery operations require, and the aircraft were processed through the post-flight cycle that ended with them returned to readiness state. The Lake Erie had maintained her operating position throughout the strike package's transit and employment. Her radar had continued its surveillance of the ballistic missile defense sector. The debris field from the intercepted missile continued to track on trajectory toward its ocean impact area. The radar tracked the major fragments to their surface impacts between 5:03 a.m. and 5:17 a.m. All fragments impacted in open water as the trajectory solution had projected. The Reagan's battle group returned to its standard operating posture at 7:15 a.m. The Lake Erie resumed her standard ballistic missile defense watch cycle, her crew rotating through the positions that the watch structure required with the particular quality of sustained attention that a crew maintains when they have just demonstrated that the watch they have been standing produces the outcome the watch was designed to produce. The radar officer, who had made the intercept confirmation report, was at his position for his next watch cycle at 8 a.m. He sat down, put on his headset, and reviewed the updated threat picture. The threat picture showed no active threats. It showed the same surveillance coverage, the same detection architecture, the same defensive posture that had been in place for 31 days. It would be in place for however many days came after this one. The watch continued. 112 nautical miles of engagement geometry. 1 SM 3 Block 2A interceptor. 4 minutes and 31 seconds from launch to intercept. 4 F-35Cs. 41 minutes to target. 8 precision munitions. 9 seconds of impact sequencing. 0 debris on Guam. 0 aircraft lost. The missile that was supposed to reach American territory did not reach it. The facility that launched it would not be launching again within any timeline that the operational planning horizon considered relevant. The Pacific is large enough to absorb the events that happen across its surface without changing its character. The water moves. The weather changes. The shipping continues. What changes is the balance of what is known about what is possible, and what is known about what the force that holds the watch is capable of doing when the thing it has been watching finally moves. On this morning, the balance moved in a specific direction. It will be remembered in the specific way that operational outcomes are remembered. In the planning documents updated to reflect what worked, in the systems refined to address what could have been better, and in the confidence of a crew that went to their next watch having done what their training prepared them to do, in the time the situation gave them to do it.